We have about 143 people logged in, so we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Jamie Simone. I am the Professional Development Officer for the Illinois chapter. Thanks for logging in this morning. Just a few housekeeping items. This session is being recorded, and this is my first time doing one of these webinar series for the AICP review, so I believe that it will, once we're done today, it will be uploaded to the Pennsylvania chapter website. So if there's anything you want to go back and review, it should be there. The slides were not available in advance today. This is the first year we're doing this AICP review session as a webinar series, and I think that's something that we may change for next year. But when we set up all the speakers this year, we didn't request that in advance. So I apologize if you were hoping to get the slides in advance. You'll have to look at the recording afterwards. Another thing to note, all of the attendees are on mute, and you will remain on mute for the entire session. If you have questions about the content of the session, you can send me a question using the question tab on your screen, and I will answer those questions as best I can during the session, but I will also keep track of those, and if there are questions that are better answered by the presenters, they will answer them at the end of their presentation. The presentation is scheduled to last about an hour, and then afterwards we'll have some time to answer the questions that you've all sent in, so you can stay on after that. I think those are all the housekeeping things I wanted to address. We have 3 speakers today. They're all members of the Illinois chapter, and they've been doing AIC prep sessions for years now. They are co-creators of Planning Prep. So I will pass it over to John Hausiel, and we'll get going. And one last thing, if you're having tech issues, please email planningwebcast@yahoo.com. If you have content-related questions,
can you see that okay on your screen?
John, I can hear you. Hold on. Oh. If you have content-related questions, send them to me as the organizer of the webinar. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to John Hausiel. Hang on, John. I'm passing it over right now.
All right. Jamie, let me know when you can see my screen.
Okay, go ahead. You should have there. Okay, I can see it.
All right, perfect. Good morning, everybody. My name is John Hausiel. We're out of Chicago. I know we have people here from several different states. And over the course of this morning, we're going to have 3 different presenters working on the presentation this morning. Myself, John Hausiel, Devin Levine, and Trevor Dick. And Trevor, Devin, and I have been providing just a little bit of a background, have been providing Planning Prep, the website, and Planning Prep, the day-long AICP training course for about the last 7 or 8 years here in Illinois, as well as training classes in other states. And the website has actually been utilized by people all over the world. So we've given this presentation several times as part of a day-long training seminar, and look forward to giving it to you today. To reiterate what Jamie said, we anticipate this lasting about an hour, maybe a little bit longer than an hour, and then opening it up for Q&A. Again, this webinar is for plan making and implementation. Plan making and implementation accounts for approximately 30% of the scoring on the AICP examination. So you give it, they'll get a sense of how much time you need to devote to the different areas as you study. And again, the purpose of this is not to give you, we get this in our classes all the time, is not to give you the answers or the exact questions that are going to be on the exam, but to prepare you for the types of knowledge you're going to be expected to have, to inform you or educate you as to the areas of things you're going to need to study for or be aware of, and the types of questions that you will likely run into on the exam, and sort of how to be prepared. So the intent is to train you and to help prepare you for taking the exam, not necessarily give you all the answers on the exam. Oh, that would be nice. A little bit about myself, just real quick. Principal and founding partner of Hausiel Levine Associates. Got about 20 years in the public and private sector. Undergraduate degree from University of Michigan, master's degree from Arizona State University. You can see some of the awards on the screen. Devin Levine is a principal and co-founder of Hausiel Levine Associates. He has about 15 years of experience in the public and private sector, and his degree is from Urban and Regional Planning in Ryerson Polytechnic University in Toronto. You can also see the other speaker this morning is Trevor Dick, Senior Associate with Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning, CMAP. He's got about 15 years of experience in the public and private sectors, and also has his degree from Urban and Regional Planning from Ryerson Polytechnic University in Toronto. Real quick, the topic areas that we're going to be covering today, for those of you that are taking notes and can write quickly, I'll read through these. There are several of them, and they're highlighted on the screen in front of you right now. Visioning and goal setting, quantitative and qualitative research methods, collecting, organizing, analyzing, and reporting data and information, demographics and economics, natural and built environment, land use and development regulations, application of legal principles, environmental analysis, growth management techniques, budgets and financing options, GIS and spatial analysis, policy analysis and decision making, development plan and project review, program evaluation, communications techniques, intergovernmental relationships, stakeholder relationships, and project and program management. Hope you guys know what you're getting into in terms of the breadth of coverage when you signed up to take the AICP exam. They really do expect you to have a pretty wide knowledge of all of these things. And as we go through this, because we're talking with people from 8 different states or several different states, keep in mind that the approach to taking the examination, not only this topic area but all of them, is a national approach or a profession-wide approach. If you happen to work for a municipality or an MPO or an organization that does things in a unique or sort of off the beaten path way, that may be good to know if you're working for that organization. But in terms of the exam, you have to think nationally. You have to think typical practice, typical procedures. So when we talk about plan commissions and city councils and zoning board of appeals and things like this, understand what is typical of the industry across the country, not what may be specific to your unique situation. So think nationally, not locally, when it comes to understanding these procedures. APA has a selected reading list for this topic area, and you can get this on the APA's website. And I won't read through all of these, but these are the things that you're going to want to come up to speed on in terms of your reading materials. There is no one single source to become prepared for the AICP exam or to take it. There is no one single book that you have to read that will give you all the answers. But you have to become familiar with a lot of this information. And the best way to do it is to begin going through the selected reading list that is provided as part of the APA website. So if you not familiar with these, check them out. If you're not familiar with utilizing the APA's website, it has some tremendous resources on there in terms of history, law, resources, reading lists. It's a pretty good setup with regard to preparing for the AICP exam. All right, the first thing I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn it over to Trevor Dick, and he is going to walk through visioning and goal setting. So here's Trevor.
Thank you, John. Good morning, everyone. The first topic that we're going to cover this morning is visioning and goal setting. This is one of the most effective and beneficial tools that planners can use to help them really, as they create their planning process, come up with long-range planning policies and eventually recommendations for long-range plans. Visioning often leads to goal statements and objectives, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes when we talk about goal setting a little bit more. But it really is a beneficial process to really ask people where do they want to be in their study area, their community over the next 10 or 15 years. And a lot of communities that planners work in are knee-deep in day-to-day issues or know the day-to-day issues and concerns. But this gives the attendees the chance to get out of the weeds, so to speak, and look at the bigger picture and really ask themselves, okay, what is the vision we want for our community? Another good benefit of visioning is it includes diverse viewpoints. I'll talk about this in a few slides, that the more different stakeholders and people and residents that you can include in the visioning process, the better. And it really allows a lot of different people to provide a lot of different comments through the process. How is the public typically involved? As I was saying, it should involve as many groups and types of people as possible, and it also should be interactive and engaging. People should feel like they're being listened to and able to be involved. That's probably pretty similar to almost every public meeting that should happen, but in visioning in particular, it's a really good chance to involve public with a lot of interactive ways. The visioning process should also be kept open and transparent. Once again, very similar to a lot of public meetings. You really want it to be open so that the public knows that a lot of the public input was heard and that also the decisions made were community-wide and not just the consultant, for example, making up the vision. Why is visioning useful? As I talked about at the beginning, visioning is one of the most beneficial tools for planners to use to try and not only involve the public, but also come up with a bigger picture. And coming up with a bigger picture will really set the framework for future goals and recommendations and minimizes reactionary approaches. By that we mean that a lot of times, like I talked about earlier, city councils or village boards are concerned with the day-to-day concerns and activities and solving the problem of the day or putting out the fire of the day. This allows them to think big picture and how little steps can come up to the bigger picture. So it avoids any reactionary or piecemeal approaches. And it's important to keep the bigger picture in sight. How are visioning results used? The results are typically used to come up with the potential policy directions and recommendations of the planning document. For example, in a comprehensive plan, it really helps set the stage for the plan's ultimate recommendations. Leading into goal setting, it's important to know what the difference between goals and objectives are. I'm sure a lot of you already are very familiar with this, but this is something that is sometimes asked or is the basis of some questions on the examination. Keep in mind that goals are higher level. Goals are value-based statements that are not necessarily measurable, but they lead to objectives which are measurable and very specific. That's also a good way for communities to see if they're actually meeting their goals by seeing how many of the objectives that they've met. What is goal setting? Once a list of community issues have been identified, and that typically is a result of the visioning exercise, goals can be established. And as I talked about at the top of the slide, after the goals, objectives can be made. The next two topic areas, research methods and data collection and presentation. We're actually going to be presenting on March 16th a webinar for quantitative and qualitative methods, data collecting, organizing, and easy for me to say, analyzing and reporting data. And we are going to cover those two topic areas in a lot more depth in that area. So kind of think of this as a placeholder, and when we talk to you again on March 16th, we'll really get into a lot more detail about those two topic areas. The next topic area that I wanted to cover is, on the next slide, John, demographics and economics. As John talked about earlier, the importance in plan-making implementation, understanding a community's current and projected demographics as well as their economic situation, and it could be their economics in terms of employment, could be their market realities. It could even get down into such detail as a specific site, pro forma for a potential site development. But understanding demographics and economics, how to understand the data, how to do some simple mathematics to estimate data, or what resources are available to help planners come up with the data are very important for not only our jobs but for the examination. Why do we estimate population? Well, it really helps us understand the current population and future populations to help us come up with long-range planning and future governmental funding. And I'll get into a little bit more detail about the funding, but really it is essential for long-range planning, especially for the ones listed here on the slide, to assist governmental agencies, the municipality or the city, decision makers, city council board members, helps them make decisions. The school districts, the special taxing districts are listed here, school districts, park districts, library districts, I would say is very essential. In fact, in our experience, school districts, if you are a planner working for a school district or assisting a school district in their long-range planning, understanding demographics is crucial. In Illinois, there's a land cash dedication ordinance, actually began in Naperville, Illinois, and there is a kind of agreed upon matrix where land cash dedication ordinance calculations are based upon future projection, and that leads to future school donations and park acreage amounts. But that's just an example of how important understanding demographics is for those special taxing districts. We all know that the country is aging, so it's important to know about how that will affect senior services and facilities moving forward. And the last bullet point here is determining and receiving federal and state funding, which I think is crucial for a lot of municipalities, especially in today's economy. Understanding what the demographics are according to the census, etc., often leads to different amounts of federal and state funding that they can apply for and receive. This here is just a screenshot taken from the U.S. Census. The census came out, and it's still coming out in different pieces. I would expect that there will be likely be questions regarding the new census on this examination. I don't think there were any questions on it in the fall because they were just trying to get some initial data, but I would expect some questions from the census on this examination. So take a look at the website, the uscensus.gov, and be familiar with the data that's on there and the different types of data sets that you can use as planners. This is just an example of the information that was on the U.S. government or U.S. Census website. This shows Rust Belt and declining populations. These are the type of questions or the type of information that is often used to help provide questions on the examination. For example, they may ask, what do these communities have in common? And you could say that they're experiencing declining populations. They could show an area on the map and say what is happening with this area, for example, and maybe even ask you what are some of the reasons why the populations are declining so rapidly in these areas. So this also gets back to, and I'm sure this other webinars have talked about this, the importance of reading the Planning magazine every month and being familiar with the topics of the day. And this is just a slide here that shows how the topics of the day and the demographics are so related. For the demographic section here, we've also shown some key population terms, and there's several. But here's just some ones to be familiar with. The first is estimates. Just know that they are based upon current population levels. Forecasts are also based on population levels, but they're more subjective and include projections. Projections are calculated on future population levels. Before the market is where it is today, I'm trying to say it as nicely as I can, a lot of projections were made, a lot of plans are having to be redone or re-looked at to try and make them more fit in with the current economic climate. And the projections are something that need to be changed right off the bat when we look at those plans. The last one is migration. Just be familiar with that. This means the movement of people in and out of a study area. Migration is typically subdivided into two categories, in-migration and out-migration. And those are the two population scenarios that are looked at in the migration area.
Trevor?
Yes, Jamie.
Can you hear me? I'm sorry,
yes.
I'm going to interrupt. I'm getting a bunch of questions from people. It looks like the attendees have been told that it will not be 2010 census data because the exam has not been updated since 2008. So instead of answering everybody's questions, I thought I would just interrupt and say I'm going to do my best to find a definitive answer to that question from the APA. And so I'll do my best to get that answered before the end of the session. So sorry for the interruption. Go ahead, Trevor.
Oh, thank you very much, Jamie. So forget that last section. I'm kidding. No, that's good to know. That's good to know. This next section, the slide here, talks about the important types of population projections. Once again, similar to the last slide, there's a lot of different population projections out there. Just be familiar with these 5 or 6 that are shown here. The first is extrapolation methods. They are good at the county level, for example. They're necessary for a little higher level, wouldn't be as applicable to a specific site or even a municipality. They are based on an observed growth trend, both linear projections, geometric projections, and exponential projections as well. The next is symptomatic methods. This basically looks at regression analysis and can be used for more smaller areas. So instead of a county level, this is where you can get down into municipality or a specific site. Housing unit methods is pretty much, the answer is in the title. It is calculated based upon the amount of housing data. Maybe it's the amount of housing or building permits that have been issued in the community, but it gets really down into the development of specific housing in the community level. The cohort survival level, this can be very complicated. Can often involve a lot of data. It is good for much larger area projections like states, and the projection is based upon past trends and data, often involving birth rates, death rates, and migration rates. The last is the ratio step-down model. This is often less technically complicated, and compares the specific study to a larger known area, for example, such as the county. Often in our class when we teach this face-to-face, we ask people what this is. This is a type of a graphic that you may see on the examination, especially now that it's computer-based. These are the type of graphics or figures you may see. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see this is a population pyramid. For a lot of people, that might be something that is pretty simple and you could spot it right away, but maybe for others who maybe aren't so their planning jobs don't really have to look at demographic projections. Maybe this is something I haven't seen since school, for example. In this you can see, and you might actually see this probably even more exaggerated, so to speak, and they might ask you what cohort or what is this community doing. You could say that it's aging, or it's got a young population that's coming through that you may need to build more schools. Maybe an aging, the bubble may be larger at the top, and that's where you knew you'd have to focus on some service, senior services, senior facilities. So just be familiar with what a population pyramid is and how to read it. This next slide moves us into more of the economics. Similar to demographics, understanding the economic climate is very important for long-range planning as well as reviewing planning documents. This first slide talks about economic base analysis, and it divides regional industries into two different sectors, the basic, which is the export, and the non-basic, which is the local sector. It assumes that the basic sector is the one that drives the economy, and this analysis can be used for determining the impact of a change in the economy and for predicting future growth. This next slide talks a little bit more detail about the basic sector assumptions. The main assumption to know here is that the basic sector is the driving force of the economy, and it's based upon the following two main assumptions. That exports from a region give the region a competitive economic edge or an advantage, and exports produce a multiplier effect that is beneficial to the local economy. For example, if there's an automaker in the community, that will support a restaurant, that will support the grocery stores, et cetera, et cetera. So everything is related in that assumption. Know the types of different approaches that can be used in an economic analysis. The first is the cost-benefit analysis. Pretty simple to explain. It really looks at a comparison of the cost of a project or specific action versus the expected benefits. And then the community has to ask themselves, should we do this project? Does the benefit outweigh the cost? The fiscal impact analysis, very similar, but it looks at more of the cost, the fiscal cost of a project and what its likely impact will be on not only the current municipal budget, but then the future budgets to try and pay for that. The empirical approach, it looks at assigning industries into the basic and non-sector basic sectors, which I talked about in the previous slide, and assumes that each industry has a good knowledge of the economy and everything is related. The minimum requirements approach, this utilizes an outside study area for reference and calibration and assumes that a regional economy will completely meet its own local demand before any exports are made. Shift share analysis, this is one that is typically asked on the examination, and we have, that's also the same, that's also true for the location quotient method, and we have two slides following this that get into some more detail. So the next slide is talking about shift share analysis, and this is actually a sample question. A shift share analysis is used primarily to A, identify the location quotient, B, identify the level of employment in a given sector of a local economy against a regional or national economy, C, identify the differences of growth or decline in a local economy, or D, identify the regional shift in a given industry. And this is a very typical question that you are likely to see on the examination. And the next slide, the answer is B, identify the level of employment in a given sector. And now I'm going to turn it back over to John, who's going to talk about the natural and built environment.
All right, and again, real quickly, just sort of to step back a second, as we go through all of these, a way to help prepare for the examination is understand the nature of what it is this category talks about plan making. As you go through the other webinar series, there's going to be history. There's going to be, to sort of understand the history of the profession, why it started, when it started, how it started, the legal foundation for the profession, what we legally can do, why we legally can do it, what we can't do, the legal understanding of it. Then there's this part, the plan making and implementation. What do we have to do to be in a position to make plans? We have to do demographic analysis, fiscal analysis, economic analysis. We have to understand environmental issues. We have to understand how to take communities through visioning processes. These are all components that we have to go through in order to develop a plan. And so keep in mind, these are the steps of creating a plan and the tools utilized in creating a plan. And if you think of it in that manner, when you come to the exam and a situational question, they might give you a scenario and say, based on this scenario, which of the following techniques is best or most important in developing a plan for this community? And you might say demographic analysis or fiscal analysis of the new development. So keep in mind that this is literally the tools utilized to develop plans as professionals. So this part is about natural and built environment, and in a couple of sections we'll be talking about environmental analysis. And they're a little bit related, but the natural and built environment, the energy policy, federal energy policy, there will be questions on the exam regarding this, period. You'll have to have a good understanding of federal, state, and local policies, and the APA Policy Guide for Energy Climate Change is a good place to go to on their website to find out. With regard to environmental policy, there will be questions specifically, more than likely, there always seem to be, based on our discussions with people who have taken the exam, on the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, Coastal Zone Management Act, when was the EPA created. There really is a lot of emphasis placed on the federal efforts initially to get into the environmental policy discussions. So again, the required reading list touches on some of this, as does the timeline that is produced on the APA's website, a sort of a timeline of key events in the planning profession. Become familiar with, like I said, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, Superfund, the Coastal Zone Management, EPA. There will be questions about when these things were formed, what the purpose of these, and the year exactly on when these agencies or policies were created. Every year these questions are on the exam, so become familiar with them. And these are terms that you should know. They will often ask a question. Again, they'll create a scenario for a community, and then they'll say, does the above scenario depict an issue regarding point or non-point pollution? So you've got to understand some of these different terminologies as they're going to be used in the narrative of the exam. So the ones that are most common are airshed and watershed. Point versus non-point pollution, that's straightforward. Point is it comes out of a pipe, so to speak, a specific point, a source of pollution. Non-point might come from an area or sedimentation or something like that, but not from a specific one point. Heat island effect, impervious versus pervious surface. This also is relative because when you get into zoning standards and questions about zoning regulations in the exam, they could ask you specifically about impervious or pervious surface questions or calculations given a scenario, and if you don't know what those two things are, you're not going to know how to calculate the answer given a site plan. Evapotranspiration, recharge areas, that's becoming an increasing issue with regard to groundwater quality, and best management practices. And what they will typically do on the examination, you'll see is, so let's say is, what is a BMP or what is a LID? And they'll give you a multiple choice, and several of them may look like their answers, and they actually might meet those initials. But understand that a BMP is a best management practice, low impact development is a LID, and green infrastructure is GI. These are things, the BMPs typically will appear on an examination. Bioswale and riparian buffer. But these are the types of terminology you're going to need to know. Now, I'll also state that as you go through these, give a decent amount of effort in keeping up with current events. I know there are other topic areas and webinars talking about current events or trends, but pick up and read Planning Magazine, pick up and read your local newspaper, go to a couple news websites, but stay up on current events, and you'll see some of these terms being used in a more general vernacular across the news sphere, and but it's going to have relevance to planning, and you should know what these terms are as they become more and more common. Next, we're going to talk about land use and development regulations, and there will be a decent amount of questions on the examination regarding this. And this is where it may be most important, harking back to what I said at the beginning of this presentation, understand the general approach to zoning, land use, special permits, and the process to get things entitled. don't necessarily think that the way your community does it or what your experience is as a developer is the way it is typically done. Be familiar with the typical standards and typical procedures for zoning and subdivision regulations. But you'll understand the basic concepts of land use designation for a principal, accessory, or special uses. What's the principal use of a site? What's the accessory use? What's the terminology? What's the difference between the two? What is the cumulative or exclusive in terms of land use, or legal non-conforming? Is something legal? Is it illegal? Is it quote-unquote grandfathered in? What are the conditions under which a non-conforming legal status is lost over time? They will give you scenario questions, asking you questions about these different components. If you don't know what they mean, you can't answer the question, but they won't come on and ask a question directly about one of these things. They will give you a situation or a scenario paragraph, and they'll say, this paragraph above applies to which one of the following. And so you've got to understand the basic concepts of this. Understand the different types of zoning that are most common. A PUD, a planned unit development, an overlay district, a TDR, transfer of development rights. Understand what incentive zoning is, or performance zoning. They'll give you a scenario that if it is the intent of a community to encourage developers to build new homes with front porches that are a minimum of 8 feet deep, what is the best technique to begin to encourage this type of development? Incentive zoning or bonus zoning or performance zoning. There's typically questions about TDRs, and there are often questions about a PUD. They'll describe a development that is approved by a PUD to give you some of the conditions of the PUD ordinance. Then they'll say, does the PUD ordinance provisions take precedent over the underlying zoning or base zoning for the site before a PUD was put into place? Understand the procedures and what these different things are. Know what a PUD is. Understand what base zoning is. Understand what a TDR is. There are lots of books out there, some of them on the preferred reading list, that specifically discuss zoning and development regulations. If you're planning for a municipality, this might be something that you don't have to spend much time on because you're familiar with it. For others, it may be something you don't deal with at all, and you need to come up to speed on it. And then subdivision regulations. What are the different types of elements of a subdivision regulations? Cul-de-sac radii, street widths, sewer requirements, parkway requirements, landscaping, line of sight, turning radii, all these types of things in terms of subdivision regulations. And again, the questions will not be an exact, what is the following, is it A, B, or C? They will give you a scenario. They will paint a picture of a paragraph or a situation and say which of the following answers best applies. So understand what subdivision regulations are. Understand zoning administration, how something gets zoning, how something gets approved, how a special use gets handled, how a variation is handled. Understand the role of the city council, village board, depending on what state you're from. City will typically use city council as the terminology. Understand the role of the planning commission. Again, in most communities, the planning commission is a recommending body to the city council. The planning commission does not approve or deny something. It makes a recommendation to approve or deny something, with that recommendation going to city council, who has the final say. Understand that sequence. Understand that the ZBA, the Zoning Board of Adjustment, is the recommending body. Again, typically it varies here and there. Is the Zoning Board of Adjustments or Zoning Board of Appeals is the zoning body that grants relief through variations or variances to provide relief to strict adherence to zoning regulations based on property hardships. They may very well ask questions about hardships, what is or isn't a hardship, a situation where a variation or a special use or a PUD may be applied, know the difference, and understand the role of planning staff in that chain of custody of the event. What is staff's role, you as a professional planner, in preparing a report, providing recommendations to the Zoning Board or Plan Commission? What if the Zoning Board or Plan Commission goes against staff's recommendation? What is your responsibility then to City Council? Understand the sequence or hierarchy of everybody involved in the zoning administration's decision-making process. Professional planning staff that is responsible to the Zoning Board of Appeals and Plan Commission. The Plan Commission and Zoning Board of Appeals, who is a recommending body to the City Council. Understand the roles of each one of those steps in the process. One of the things that's getting more and more attention is urban design and design guidelines. So image and identity, understand the different components of design guidelines, typically facade, architectural, public spaces, parking, signage, landscaping, buffer treatments, All these different types of components are more and more commonly used now for design guidelines with more effectiveness. They will often ask questions relating to urban design or to design guideline components. Sometimes they'll be perceived as very much architectural or architect's questions, but they will ask you. Here's some examples. If you look at the image on the left, you'll see the building in sort of a historic small downtown, and they have A, B, C, D on the building, and the question might be, what is C above? And then you see the garage on the right. They'll say a lot of ordinances are addressing the development of new single-family homes. How is the garage on the picture at the right characterized? And the answers would be that on the picture on the left, A is a decorative cornice, C is a window hood, D is window display, and B is bulkhead. And they may very well ask you that type of thing to see if do you understand the basics of architecture, do you understand the basics of urban design components and design guidelines. And again, with regard to possibly writing a zoning ordinance or design guidelines for a single-family neighborhood, that garage is described as side-facing, front-loading. So the garage bulk is loaded onto the front of the structure. The doors are facing the side, so side-facing, front-loading. These are the types of questions you need to know about in terms of the practical application of design guidelines in urban design, because it relates specifically back to design guidelines or zoning. A little bit for form-based code. Be familiar with this. This is sort of, I guess before sustainability was the flavor of the month or flavor of the decade in terms of what's popular, it was form-based code. And form-based code still has some relevance in certain areas. You know, it's a method of regulating development to achieve a specific urban form. And understand what is form-based code versus an incentive zoning versus Euclidean zoning. Again, they will paint a scenario picture and then say which one of these zoning applications or approaches is best to solve this problem. Understand what form-based code is against all the other types of zoning codes. Smart code is an example of that, sort of a base model code. It's a model Transect-based development code available for all scales of planning, from region to the community to the block. The code is intended for local calibration for your town or your neighborhood. It's a basic sort of a form-based code base model. It's free, it's out there, and it's been around for a while, so they could very well ask questions about the application of smart code. LEED for neighborhood development. LEED and sustainable stuff, there will be questions about this on the exam, no question. LEED for neighborhood development is relatively new, so there may very well be questions about it. Understand the rating system that integrates the principles of smart growth, urbanism, and green buildings. It's the first national system for neighborhood design ever. Independent third-party verification of environmentally responsible and sustainable development. And it was a collaboration among the U.S. GBC, the Congress for New Urbanism, and the Natural Resource Defense Council. So this has been coming on really strong in the last few years. People have been waiting for it with bated breath for a while. It's finally sort of here. So understand what it is and its potential application as a planning professional. All right, I'm now going to turn it over to Trevor. He's going to walk through quickly some of the application of legal principles.
Thanks, John. Okay, this section here, the application of legal principles, we're just going to highlight for you some of the key legal basis decisions that help you in your daily lives as a planner. Unlike the specific law section that's going to be held for you later on in this series of webinars, this one here is more concerned about how to apply these planning case laws into your daily assignments or work. We're briefly going to talk about the legal basis decisions, some of the key ones for police power, takings, eminent domain, zoning, religion, and growth management. And all of those are the type of land use control decisions that affect typically a lot of our daily planning lives and planning work projects that we do. The first, and there are several that basically give the basis or the police power for zoning in this country. The first one and the only one we really showed here right now is one of the most important, Village of Euclid versus Ambler Realty back in 1926. And this is one of those benchmark case laws that said that zoning is the proper use of the police power as decided upon by the U.S. Supreme Court. The next slide talks about takings. This is something especially when we make planning decisions, when we do development review. Typically, if you work for a park district, for example, and you want to work with the developer to dedicate park space, for example, quite often takings is an issue that comes up. And these are two of the most famous examples. Like I said earlier, there are half a dozen, if not a dozen or more examples. These are just the two we wanted to show you this morning. Lucas versus South Carolina Coastal Council back in 1992. The U.S. Supreme Court said that if the regulation is not based on a public nuisance and it causes the property to lose all economic value, then it is a taking. Pennsylvania Coal versus Mann back in 1922. This also said that if a regulation goes too far, it is a taking. So just be familiar with the different types of case law dealing with takings, the different type of examples. I know one of the famous examples is Penn Central Station in New York. Be familiar with that case law and how that impacted not only takings, but that one had a direct effect with historic preservation as well. The next is eminent domain. This is those two examples here. The first is Burnham versus Parker back in 1954. The U.S. Supreme Court decided that aesthetics were a valid public purpose for an eminent domain action. Groundbreaking case law. Then in 2005, and one that's come up, we believe, from talking to people over the last several exams, is something dealing with Kelo versus the City of New London. This was probably, if not the last, one of the last big U.S. Supreme Court decisions that affected planning. And this was very controversial. Some states have since come up with their own decisions to try and come to terms with this, or either just accept it, or have kind of tried to get around it or go against it. But basically, the city's use of eminent domain in that example for redevelopment was actually considered a public use. So development was actually, property was acquired and was allowed to be developed, and that was actually considered a public use at the time. So that was the first case where that was decided. And there's a lot more information not only in planning prep but in the research you'll find about those cases, but I just wanted to give you some highlights. The next is zoning regulations. I talked about this a little bit earlier with police power, but this gets into even more examples when we do development review or ask people to come up with setbacks, for example. It's important to be able to reference Eubank versus the City of Richmond and say back in 1912, the U.S. Supreme Court was the first decision where they approved setback regulations. And Hadacek versus Sebastian, way back in 1915, the U.S. Supreme Court first decided that an instance of regulating location of land uses, so not only just zoning but also locating the different type of land uses in a community was a decision. Religion. There's a lot of religious legal principles or legal cases that have been made, a lot dealing with sexual-oriented businesses, billboards, first, et cetera, et cetera. But the one example we want to show here is the RLUIPA, which was back in 2000, the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act. Be very familiar with this case law. This really laid out a Supreme Court decision where land use provisions protected individuals, houses of worship, and other religious institutions from discrimination in zoning and landmarking laws. And that's something that comes up a lot, for example, when religious institutions now, for example, are trying to locate in industrial parks. They're trying to locate in neighborhoods. And you just have to be familiar with this case law so you don't get yourself into trouble. The last slide in this section is growth management. This is something, especially when the economy was hot, so to speak, a lot of us had to deal with a lot, but these are two of the most famous legal principles. Golden versus Planning Board of the town of Ramapo, 1972, and it's a growth management system which was approved. And that was actually the community looking at how much growth or how much development could happen in a given year. Also Sonoma versus Petaluma in 1975. This also looked at the quotas more specifically on the annual number of building permits, and that was actually upheld by the U.S. Court of Appeals. This next section, environmental analysis, I'm going to turn it back over to John.
All right, thanks. And real quick, I just want to emphasize what Trevor was just going over with regard to the legal foundation for some of that stuff. I know the legal analysis or the legal understanding of the professions may very well be a separate webinar, but in terms of plan making, if you're looking at how do you prevent churches from locating in the tax revenue generating areas of a commercial corridor, and try to get them to locate someplace else. How do you know how far you can push with regard to eminent domain, whether it's in a TIF district or not a TIF district, as a tool to encourage redevelopment? Well, now this U.S. Supreme Court says that economic development itself is a public good, and you can use eminent domain. So it's a tool that may be available if your local state laws didn't usurp that authority. But the principle of the 7 or 8 things that Trevor went through was not to sort of give you an in-depth background of law, but if you're looking at developing or plan making, you have to understand what is or is not available to you legally as a tool to make a plan to achieve your community's objectives. So understand those legal concepts in the terms of what is available to you for plan making. So environmental analysis, real quickly, they're not going to expect you to go out and do a phase 1 study, but they are going to ask you a couple of things. NEPA, National Environmental Protection or Policy Act, will be on the exam. I know that there are equator questions on the, if you guys didn't know this, there are equator questions on the exams that show up every year, year after year, year after year, year after year, as sort of a baseline as how that year's AICP exam takers are doing. This may or may not be an equator question, I don't know, but all I know is from talking to anybody who's ever taken the exam, this is on there. So there will be likely information or a question on NEPA. And according to NEPA, whenever the U.S. federal government takes a major federal action significantly affecting the quality of human environment, it must first consider the environmental impact in a document called an EIS, Environmental Impact Statement. Again, there will likely be questions specifically about EISs. So know what NEPA is, why it was created, know what an EIS is and when it is used and what its key components are, because it will likely be on the exam. An EIS typically has 4 sections. Purpose and need, or so an introduction including a statement of the purpose and the need and the proposed action, a description of the affected environment, on when maybe they're building an airport or a new highway or some sort of other regional infrastructure or project, they have to do these things. A range of alternatives to the proposed action. Alternatives are considered the heart of the EIS. If we do, if the highway goes here, here's the environmental impact. If the highway is shifted over to here, here's the impact of the environmental assessment. And one of the range of alternatives in an EIS is always do nothing. So in order to really assess the impact on the environment, an EIS has to look at several alternatives that are considered, and one of the ones by law it has to consider is, what if we don't do this project? What's the impact on the environment? Because sometimes a major federal project may be a dam, it may be some flood mitigation, it may be specifically to mitigate an environmental problem. So to do nothing, it'd say, well, if we don't do anything, flooding will get worse. So do nothing is one of the alternatives it has to consider. And then an analysis of the environmental impacts of each possible alternative. So it has to analyze what the environmental impact would be of the different alternatives considered. So understand, again, the NEPA process. We're talking about the purpose and need of a project, the affected environments and the constraints, any alternatives that should be discussed. Public involvement is included, mitigation of anything that may come up as a problem, and this is, excuse me, the process of NEPA for an EIS. Next, I want to just touch a little bit about growth management. Over the past couple of decades, a big thing has been sprawl. And communities across the country, and especially the profession of planning, has seemed to had done a much better job of stopping sprawl, or specifically in a very direct manner addressing sprawl. Where in the past, as a country, we have not done a good job, and as a profession, we have fallen short in the last couple of decades. There are a number of different things that are being done to eliminate sprawl, as we now begin to see as a profession the impacts of increased commute time, environmental degradation, pollution going through the roof, loss of valuable agricultural production property or land. All these things are problems. The cost of maintaining extensive infrastructure to service areas that are 3 miles away from the city with a new development. These are all issues that we've begun to see develop and communities really struggle with. So understand the different techniques that are used for growth management. Some of them are public facilities and infrastructure, concurrency requirements or adjacency requirements, and more coordinated CIPs, capital improvement programming or planning. Concurrency or adjacency requirements prevent leapfrog development, if you will. If you have a community and a developer wants to come in and build a 400-acre development, he has to do it immediately adjacent to or concurrent to the existing infrastructure or adjacent to an existing developed area. He can't jump out 2 miles because he's able to get somebody's farm and build it out and then run 2 miles of infrastructure out to that location. So it's a technique that's beginning to be used. But better control and better planning and better regulatory adherence to public facilities and public infrastructure as a way of managing growth and limiting where it can go and directing it. Defining and planning documents urban growth areas. Having impact fees that are directly correlate back to the installation of and long-term maintenance of service needs for development. Not to try to get a bunch of money out of them as a negative impact or a deterrent, but if development goes in, it needs to have the impact fees that are appropriate or proportional to pay for the infrastructure, to pay for the increase in police service, to pay for the increase in fire protection or ambulatory service to this area, water, sewer, everything else. So that makes sure the development pays its fair share. TDR is transfer development rights. It may very well be that in order to prevent development in one area, whether it be a site-specific area or an area within a growth boundary, the TDR can be used to say, listen, we don't want growth to go in this area. We prefer it to go up north as opposed to out west. We will transfer the development rights for what you could have done out west to your property up north, give you more up north, but leave the west alone. So transfer development rights is pretty good. Moratoriums is also very effective to curtail development in an area while a study is taking place. And then adherence to smart growth. And the APA policy guide on smart growth is a good place to look. If you look at this slide, it gives you some of the basics of smart growth and a growth management technique that is smart growth. You can get some of this on the APA website, and they have pretty good policy regarding this. But to create a range of housing opportunities and choices, to create walkable neighborhoods, to encourage community and stakeholder collaboration, foster attractive communities with a strong sense of place, make decisions that are predictable, fair, and cost-effective for all parties involved, to provide a mix of land uses, not necessarily segregate land uses out through sprawling development, to preserve open space. Sometimes to preserve open space, you have to provide development incentives in other areas to provide other areas that remain open, hence TDR. Provide a variety of transportation choices, strengthen and direct development towards existing communities as opposed to new undeveloped areas, and take advantage of compact building design. While these are principles of smart growth and part of the APA policy on smart growth, many of these can be used directly and formed into regulatory approaches to limit or guide growth and development. Smart growth strategies, urban growth boundaries, adequate public facilities, concurrency requirements, reuse of existing buildings, and impact fees for somebody that might develop in areas new. And impacts of smart growth, higher density, increased utilization of existing, often older, inadequate infrastructure. This bullet, this infrastructure issue, has become hypersensitive and may be one of the driving issues at this point with regard to limiting growth. Communities simply cannot afford to install and, more importantly, maintain over the long haul the cost of infrastructure to growth areas. I'm now going to turn it over to Trevor, and he's going to talk about budgeting and financing options.
Thank you, John. You're probably starting to see, too, that a lot of these are interrelated. This one here, budget and financing, relates a lot to the demographic and economic section, and you'll see later it relates a lot to even the project and program management section. But really, the overall thing to keep in mind in this section is that you have to be familiar with the different types of budgeting and financing options that are out there and how to use them. Also be familiar with how to understand the different ways that they're calculated, and more specifically, how budgets make plans work. A lot of times when we do planning or when we do plans, we're often asked, how are things going to be implemented? How can you assure that this plan will come to fruition? Well, oftentimes we say that as long as you tie it to a budget, that often leads to one of the greatest chances of the actual plan being implemented. But also be familiar with the different types of budgets and financing options that are available for the different types of recommendations that you may come up with. Types of budgets. These here are the 5 main types of budgets that are typically asked on the examination. The first is the zero-based budget. Pretty easy to remember. The best way to remember it is that it starts from scratch every year. some previous examinations that I know about. That's actually one of the questions, is which budget starts from scratch every year. So be familiar with that, and it largely depends on last year's budget. The PPBS, which is the Program Planning and Budgeting System, this links goals to objectives. It really helps to determine how to fund each specific program by linking it to what the potential outcome would be. PERT, which is the Program Evaluation and Review Technique, it was developed to handle more complex or even larger projects. There's a lot of different ways to make things happen, a lot of different ways to measure the results, and the PERT is one of those techniques that really looks at one of those larger projects. I think even an example, for example, John was talking about a dam or a federal project. Quite often that's used in trying to come up with budgeting for those type of larger projects. And it may very likely be on the examination, right? The GIM, which is the goals, or the GAM, which is the Goals Achievements Matrix. And this type of technique looks at objectives which are broken down into more measurable indicators. So what you do is you come up with the objectives and you look at, okay, what are the indicators to measure those objectives? You then rank the alternative strategies. You come up with different strategies to come up with those objectives and rank them. You weight the objectives. And then lastly, you create a score for each alternative. And that really helps you pick which course of action, almost like a choose your own adventure. That's the type of technique that you would use to pick that budget. And the last is the Capital Improvements Program, the CIP. This is typically something we see the municipalities have. It's typically 5 years, and it is often tied to the annual budget. It is often, in our opinion, too, probably one of the most successful ways for specific, let's say, capital projects or recommendations of a plan to get actually implemented by a municipality, because they can budget over the next 5 years and seek funding sources and put it on their budget horizon. And so that's a very, very powerful budget tool. The next slide, another financing option is state and federal grants, and there is a number of different grants out there. Be familiar with all of the grants that are available. It changes almost constantly, but just be familiar with some of the big ones, some of the state or federal grants. Keep in mind, for example, that as John talked about at the beginning, this is a national examination. So if you live in a state where there's a specific, like for example the IDNR OSLAD grant, maybe different states have open space land acquisition grants, but maybe they're not called the OSLAD grants. So just be familiar with those type of funding sources that are out there from more of a national perspective. And grants are typically awarded applicants with conditions attached. It's often there's a dollar amount budgeted. Municipalities, if they get the grant, can't go over it. And also there's a timeline. There's a certain amount of time where you have to spend the money and get the project done. Often applying for grants too, as John will tell you, I know he applies for a lot of grants on behalf of municipalities. There's a lot of work that goes into applying for a grant, a lot of paperwork. So just be familiar with there's a lot of front-end work as well. The next financing option, one of the most popular too, especially here in Illinois, is the TIF, Tax Increment Financing. Be familiar with this. There's a lot of detail, a lot of case law on this. We just show on this side some of the main points. Really, the thing to keep in mind is that it is a way to improve, let's say, quote-unquote, a blighted area. And there's a definition and requirements that need to be met to make an area designated a blighted area. Once the area is blighted, a TIF bond is issued to develop the designated area, and that increment, the amount of tax revenue that's gained from the redevelopment site, is then used to actually retire the TIF bond. And it cannot be used by the special taxing districts, for example, the school districts or the park districts, until the TIF bonds are retired. The next financing option slide talks about some other municipal financing options. The most popular, the main source of income for most municipalities and tax districts is property taxes. I know because I just saw my property tax bill. So I'm eating lunches in the office a little bit more often right now, but property taxes are the main source for those districts. Current revenue, those are the funds that are raised through traditional taxing methods. Reserve funds, these are funds that municipalities or districts often place aside, almost a rainy day fund for emergency purposes. General obligation funds, this is where the agency or the municipality is pledged to retire these bonds with the full commitment of their taxing body. and then the revenue bonds are usually sold to finance projects that will eventually and hopefully produce revenues. This next option is special assessments. I just wanted to show this real quickly. Another funding source might be special assessments. Special tax, for example, may be assessed on businesses in a designated downtown area. If the community wants to build a public parking structure, they may ask those local businesses within a walking distance of a certain radius from the parking garage, hopefully those they expect to actually benefit from the parking structure, to pay a special tax assessment. Another one is that special taxing authorities or districts such as park districts or school districts are assess a special tax rate onto residents in that community. And now, with the GIS and spatial analysis section, I'm going to turn it over to Devin Levine.
All right, thank you, Trevor. Let's see, the pertaining to GIS and spatial analysis, referring back to the slide about the APA's recommended reading, they list a book. It's called An Introduction to GIS, and I guess based on that title, it sounds like a cursory introduction into GIS. The book is actually a university textbook on GIS systems. If you look on Amazon, it's about $120, and I guess to save you some money in how this exam will put you into sort of any planner in any town USA, it's not going to get incredibly detailed into GIS, and so I think I would be familiar with what is GIS. And if you go to Esri's website, esri.com, right on the home page there's a link to I think what is GIS. You can also go to gis.com. It's a separate site that's maintained by ESRI, and it's an introduction to what GIS is and what it's capable of, and I think that's probably the level of understanding that this exam will test you on. Sort of related to GIS and spatial analysis, I would know what a typical map element is. I'd almost say these are required map elements and found on just about every single map: a title, a legend, a north arrow, and then a scale, a representative and a graphic scale. And this might be a type of question where you might have a graphic scale, and you might have to measure how many feet one building is from another, or how close a residential property is from another property. So there might be some math that would relate to some type of scaling. And then also related to GIS is layering information. Sort of the true power of GIS is to be able to run spatial queries, taking layers of information and seeing how they relate to others, which sort of touches on the proximity analysis, to be able to take a site and provide a buffer. So if there's a public hearing notice requirement of 500 feet from a subject property, GIS can easily do some type of buffering analysis, also related to proximity to a stream bank or some other type of sensitive environmental area. And you get into network analysis, which is routing. Sort of how a pedestrian would walk to a park site as opposed to just taking a half-mile buffer. How that person might walk there would be based on a route, so either through some type of sidewalk line file or a right-of-way or a center line file. But GIS has two different ways to do analysis, through networking and then also through proximity. So this is an example of sort of both. You can see these concentric rings, which show some type of buffer analysis. And routing, or that network analysis, is shown in that red shape. And the difference being, one is a 10-minute drive and a 5-minute drive, and the other one is a based on distance. And so those are the two types of analysis you can perform with GIS. And again, refer to gis.com and ESRI's website to get a basic understanding of GIS if you're not familiar with it. And it should give you the breadth of knowledge you'll need to handle any questions that might show up on the exam pertaining to GIS. And then I would almost bank on some type of question between the difference between raster and vector data. Raster information refers to, an image like the aerial photograph on the left, any type of ortho image, which is an aerial photograph, is raster, meaning it's their information stored in pixels. Vector, and for the purpose of this presentation, the vector graphic on the right has been rasterized for the presentation, but vector information is lines and geometry. And so if you take your typical GIS system, it's comprised of both raster and vector data. Vector would be your parcel lines, right-of-way, and then your raster data will be your aerial photographs. And GIS can calculate different types of raster sets like hillshade and elevation, any type of heat map. So and you can usually tell the difference if you zoom into the data. If it starts to pixelate, it's raster. If it sort of maintains its fidelity and it's crystal clear regardless of what zoom level, it's vector data.
All right, now we're going to jump in real quick. This is John again on policy analysis and decision making. At some point as professional planners, you have to sort of step back and assess policy decisions and decisions that either were made in the past, decisions you're currently making, or recommendations as a professional you're thinking need to be made by your elected officials or organization moving forward. And we have here the slide that says, Sir Isaac Newton said that for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. Well, in planning, for every action there's some sort of a reaction as well. It's not always equal. It's not always it's not always fair, but there's almost always a reaction, and you have to be cognizant of that, both in terms of how situations are presented to the public, and as well as sort of going back and evaluating maybe the unintended consequence of the zoning decision that was made with regard to the sign ordinance or densities or multifamily or affordable housing. You have to be able to go back and do a little bit of analysis of the policy in order to make better and more informed decision making, to evaluate what was done in the past and as well as going forward. So the role of the planner is to inform decision making, and sometimes this can be frustrating if you work in the public sector or the private sector. As a professional, you get paid direct recommendations to people who ultimately will make the policy decisions. It may very well be that you're a staff planner in a community and the mayor is a dentist, and his only familiarity with how to run a city or zoning or planning or land use or capital improvements or expenditures is zero. He may have just been elected because he's been there for a while and he wants to run for local office. You as a professional has to try to help him make informed decision making and to set policy. And sometimes our jobs as planners is not just to consult and to recommend, but to educate as to why things are done, what should be done, and the consequences of either doing something or the consequences of inaction. So we have to be able to analyze policy, and that's an important step. There's no one specific way to analyze policy. There are some things that are popping up that are pretty effective. Counterfactual analysis is one I think is effective. Counterfactual analysis is where you take a policy and say, boy, if we went back 20 years ago and eliminated the requirement for homes to have front garage doors or front loaded garages, and we enacted that zoning change 20 years ago, then project ahead all the building permits that took place over the last 20 years and change the character of those buildings to not have garages in the front but garages in the back, it would have transformed neighborhoods. And if through visualization techniques, whether it be through SketchUp or CAD 3D or something else, you can begin to visually communicate or visualize this change in policy historically. And it's a way to sort of present policy analysis to say, here's the unintended consequence of the policy decision that was made. Or you can do analysis to say, going forward, I think if we make this decision, here is what it could lead to or the impact it could cause, so maybe we don't want to undertake or we do want to undertake the policy. But be prepared to understand the value of providing analysis to different policies. And you're not going to be required to know specific names of analysis techniques, but understand in a scenario-based question, again, I keep stating that because it's so prevalent in the examination. Again, real quick side note here, again, a footnote. Some aspects of the examination are memorization. They're questions you just need to know. What is Euclid versus Ambler? Who was responsible for the City Beautiful movement? These are memorization things. Other things are things you have to figure out, some simple math, some FAR calculations, some setbacks, some height, maybe some simple math. Other things are having a knowledge of the profession. This is why there is an experience requirement before you are eligible to even take the exam. And a lot of this can't really be taught. You can read about it, but a lot of it is based on my professional experience. I have come across this. I understand the nuance of this requirement or this condition. Understanding how to analyze policy is part of one of these things. The more you do it, the more you understand the value of it and how to do it. Another one is scenario or data-based modeling. We have a lot of traffic modeling, maybe economic forecasts, demographic modeling, and traffic modeling are the three different types of modeling categories that are most heavily utilized by the profession, either directly or indirectly. We did some comprehensive planning work for an entire county, teamed up with University of Illinois, who conducted a LEAM model, which is Land Use Evaluation and Impact Assessment Model. And that's when we were able to do a scenario-based modeling for the entire county to take a look at areas of existing residential, existing commercial, existing open space, as well as projected new residential and new commercial in 2040. And based on modeling of land use development, traffic, and other things produced by the LEAM model by the university, we were able to make more informed decisions and recommendations to the county board with regard to where development should take place, and maybe more importantly, where development should not take place. But again, modeling for land use and development, modeling for transportation, modeling for economics, and modeling for demographics and projections are ways for us to begin to assess, analyze, and maybe more importantly, inform policy and decision making as part of our planning, development, and recommendations. So I'm going to turn this over now to Trevor real quickly. He's going to talk a little bit about development plan and project review.
Thanks, John. For this topic, one of the key things to know about is the knowledge of how a project is generally reviewed. Once again, keep in mind from a national perspective, you may do things differently in your community than in others, but just be familiar with the typical steps in the review process. We're going to talk a little bit about what to be aware of and what types of factors to consider when you do a development or project review, and then also be familiar with the different types of players and how they are involved in a review process, maybe what the role is and what the steps is. Two types of review that we wanted to share with you. The first is the technical site plan review, and the second is the planning documents or plan review. The first technical site plan review is where you really get into the nitty-gritty. You get down into reviewing a specific project, for example, or a development proposal, and you look at all regulatory documents. Look at the municipal codes, the ordinances, any plan that may impact that project for a comprehensive plan or a corridor plan or even urban design guidelines. And also in this step you may need to work with, and it's quite oftentimes you work with other specialties such as engineers, architects, or landscape architects. Typically when you do development review, you get memorandums maybe, letters of opinion from each of those experts, and that gets presented to the decision makers. The second type of review is the planning document or plan review. We just wanted to put this in here because it's important to remember that not just the technical site plan review, but any comprehensive plans that you have on the books, make sure you come back and revisit them. Make sure that they're as up-to-date as possible, and it will really help you make sure that you implement the successful components of that plan. Typical development review processes. Just be familiar with the different types of review that can happen. We just listed here about 6 different types of reviews that are very common for a planner to do. Rezoning, that's something that planners are quite often the lead employee for a municipality on. Be familiar with special or conditional use permits, design and site plan review, historic preservation review, subdivisions, and variances. There's a lot of different information out there describing each of those. I'm not going to go through it right now, but just be familiar with the different types of review processes that planners often do. This slide here, we also just wanted to show some examples of factors to consider. It's important that a planner just not look at one document or one information source, but to try and think big picture all the time. And this is just some factors to consider. You can see from this list that it isn't just one thing that you look at. You should look at the surrounding uses. You should look at the geography, the economics, the demographics. Pretty much everything we talk about in this entire webinar this morning are the things you should keep in mind when you do a project review. The review findings and analysis. This is typically the review process. John actually touched on this back in an earlier section when he was talking about the land use and development regulations. Be familiar with the process for chain of command, so to speak. And so it usually starts with the planner coming up with a memorandum of opinion, identifying issues or deficiencies, things that need to be addressed, and make sure you support it by facts. Reference back to an existing code, an existing ordinance, an existing plan. The more facts you can provide, the better. The planner is generally responsible to make an unbiased professional level recommendation. You'll probably see that a lot or hear that a lot from the person or a group that's talking about the ethics webinar. That's something that comes up a lot. Make sure you do an unbiased professional recommendation. And then the last point just talks about what John was talking about earlier. Typically it goes to your boss, followed by a presentation or a review by the Public or Planning Commission, which is the elected officials and the recommendation body, which then goes on to the elected officials, which is the actual final decision maker. This next category is program evaluation. We just wanted to talk about 3 of the main programs that are available to help people, to help planners do project management. A lot of these are software evaluation tools now. The first is CPM, Critical Path Method. This is where it's used to determine optimal solution, and accomplishes this by estimating for each of the specific tasks an expected cost and estimated time necessary to complete that project. Typically this is a straight line graphic. We don't have a graphic here, but you'll see it in your books and your other study material. The critical path method is often the path of least resistance, so to speak. The next is Gantt charts. This is something that's very common, especially I think in the projects we work on, and is very helpful when you have a lot of different players. You can share this with sub-consultants. Everybody's familiar with it. It has tasks along the y-axis, and time is generally depicted along the x-axis. And then you can estimate and follow the time period for the length of the entire project. The next is PERT, which is something that was developed in the 1950s originally by the U.S. Navy. It's commonly used in conjunction with the critical path method, and this is something that is often used for projects with a lot of players, a lot of different actions that are necessary. And if you look at a graphic of it, it often looks like a web, a spider web. It can sprout off in different directions. So you may actually see a diagram of that on the examination. And now I'm going to turn it back over to John for communication techniques.
Okay, this slide could be titled Stating the Obvious as opposed to Communication Techniques. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time expounding on it, but understand the importance of what is bulleted out on the slide in terms of questions that may be asked on the examination. And again, think of it in terms of you as a professional planner committing to this profession in terms of how you communicate plan recommendations. Depending on what the audience is, it may be a neighborhood group, it may be a housing advocacy group, it may be the city council, it may be a group of business leaders, it may be high school students. You have to be able to effectively communicate to all of these different groups using different mediums and different techniques depending on what the messages you are trying to convey or what information you're trying to process or obtain from the group that you're talking to. So be familiar with the different types of communication and presentation techniques. And again, I'm not going to try to teach you all of these obviously, but be familiar with them. Again, these will be scenario-based questions. They will say you as a planning professional, they'll create a scenario where you're trying to convey, let's say, a development concept to a list of economic development professionals. Which is the best way to present this information to the group? Understand PowerPoint presentations or keynote presentations. Understand when to use presentation boards, maybe an open house setting where people can come in and mill around for a couple hours as opposed to a specific 20-minute presentation. Understand the purpose and function of memorandums when crafted by you or received from you by somebody else. Understand the impact of an oral presentation when simply an oral presentation is the best form of communication. And review the entire planning document. So understand the different types of techniques to be used in different areas to provide the most effective type of communication. because regardless of what type of planning professional or planning area of expertise you are in or desire to get into, communication is essential. I mean, even GIS or 3D modeling or SketchUp can be utilized as a way of visual communication. So understand the importance of communication in this profession and understand the benefits and the shortcomings of each type of communication and when and how best to use it or when how to not use it. So I'm going to kick it back over to Trevor for intergovernmental relationships.
Thanks, John. Intergovernmental relationships, it really is important for planners to know that they're not acting alone and that a lot of plans need the help of different governmental agencies, a lot of stakeholders, residents, and business owners for that matter. But this really is getting at the point to keep thinking about how to be successful, to make your plan successful, involving other governmental agencies to help you in the planning process and implement the plans are really essential. This first slide talks about two different types of governmental functions, line functions and staff functions. This is something to keep in mind, that line functions are those that provide the services directly to the public, and staff functions are those which generally assist or help the line functions do their work. That's something that often comes up in the examination, so if we'd be familiar with the differences between line functions and staff functions. This slide here talks about the different types of local governments. Really what we're trying to say in this slide is just be familiar with the different type of internal planning that happens at a municipality level. There are two examples we show here. The planning department. This is your more traditional planning department that may have subcategories or subgroups that look at plan review or long-range planning or maybe do zoning analysis. But we're also seeing a lot of communities that have community development departments. This typically leads to involving more economic development and implementation steps. Often it is something that really is tied into a capital improvements program, the annual budget, but there are two different types of planning departments that we typically see. We've talked about this a bunch already. Just be familiar with the different roles of the elected appointed officials in your community and in the planning process, and know how important they are. These are two examples of potential government partners. Just real quickly, special districts and then county or regional governments as well as federal agencies. Just be familiar with the different type of partners that maybe impact your community, have jurisdiction in your community, or have documents or plans that involve your community. Quite often a county, for example, has a bike trail plan already that may come through your community. So it's important to know what the county has planned, just to make sure that that is a successful, in this example, a bike trail that can actually get built. This slide here talks about some examples of specific planning projects where different governments should work together. We should always keep in mind that you'll hear time and time again that the planner's obligation is to the overall public good. And a lot of times the best way to do that is for planners to work with other agencies and governmental agencies to advance that public good. Some of the example projects here are TIFs, school and park dedication reviews, watershed planning, transportation planning, intergovernmental grants. For the TIF, I show here an example here in Illinois, the Glen in Glenview, Illinois. It's an example of different governmental agencies working together, from the U.S. Navy all the way through the village to the school district, park district, etc., to a major redevelopment of a closed U.S. Navy base. Another one I just wanted to mention here is transportation planning. John Housefield says this time and time again that transportation issues know no municipal boundary, and what he means by that is that when you're driving a car, you're stuck in traffic, you don't really know or care what community you're in. This is an example of where many municipalities need to work together, or a county or the federal or state, because just solving the issues in one municipality isn't going to help. Stakeholder relationships. This section here talks about the different type of relationships, not only with government, but to remember that a planner's responsibility is the public, and as we all know, planning is political. It can be very political, quite frankly, and this section here talks about the importance of trying to balance those two facts. One of the ways to do that is to involve as many stakeholders in the planning process as possible. We list here some of the different stakeholders that that could be included in the process, but the main point is that if you involve as many different representatives or stakeholders in the process early and often, it really helps you not only get through the process, but will definitely help you in the formal adoption process. Building and maintaining strong relationships with stakeholders will benefit the process in these following ways. Consensus building. It'll help you get to recommendations and policy where most of the community wants to head. It has the potential of avoiding unnecessary conflicts. I think we've all been in the process where somebody comes into the meeting at the very end and says, I didn't know about this plan, I didn't know it was happening, although it's been going on for 10 months and we've been in all the papers and the websites. You know, sometimes somebody can come up at the last minute and really just derail things, so this helps avoid that. Stakeholders can also help spread the spread the word, especially if they're a representative of an agency, a neighborhood group. They can be your conduit to help get the word out about your project, and at the end of the day, they can be your biggest supporters and actually the ones that implement the plan. If you have a big business owner on your steering committee, for example, when you leave, you know what? That business owner might be the one who either benefits from the plan or actually has the funds to implement a lot of what you're recommending. The last topic area is project and program management, and we've talked a lot about this in a lot of different sections, but we just wanted to quickly talk about how planners in both the public and private sector need to have strong project and program management tools. There's a lot of software out there. We've talked about the different ways to help manage a process. I know especially in the private sector, those private sector planners out there listening, you know how important it is to finish a project on time, on budget, and actually under time and under budget is even better. But be familiar with that, or know how important that is for both public and the private sector planners. And you need to know how to be in charge of a project, but also how to work with a team. That's something that is often asked on the examination, is how would you work with a team to solve a group dynamic problem. Know how to negotiate, and lastly, learn how to complete the project on time and on budget. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to John for a wrap-up, and then we're going to open it up for any questions.
All right, thanks for hanging in there. I know we went about 90 minutes. It's a lot of material, and I can't emphasize enough that when you take the examination, again, we've been training for this exam for about 8 years in several states. The breadth of what you're expected to cover is pretty wide, so start studying early, study often, work with study groups if that's more effective for you, but there's a lot of material out there that you have to become familiar with. You don't necessarily need to be an expert in any one of those, but you need to have a broad understanding of all aspects of planning as a profession, and it is that broad understanding and application of planning principles and understanding that is going to be what they are trying to test you on. They're not trying to trip you up or get you on any one specific thing, but they're trying to test your knowledge as a planning professional. So there's a lot of different things you need to cover. So with that, we think we've effectively covered all the different areas that you're going to need to be responsible for, and hopefully provided some understanding with the rationale or what it is that the APA feels is most important with regard to getting AICP certification, and an understanding of what it is you need to understand when it comes to plan making and implementation, whether it be the tools, techniques, methods, or procedures that you are expected to have an understanding of to help you as a professional draft and develop plans. So with that, I will turn it over, I guess, to Jamie or anybody else out there to facilitate questions.
I'm ready. Just a couple notes. A lot of people have emailed, and I know I put in the chat window, and I'm not sure all of you are looking at the chat window. All of the sessions from this webinar for the AICP exam prep can be found at utah-apa.org/webcast-archive. And I went fast, but if you look in your little chat window, it's there. There are PDFs available for some of the sessions, and I believe for all of the sessions, if you right-click on the title of the session, it will open in Windows Media Player, and it will show you the recorded session. So I believe all of the sessions are there, with the exception of maybe there might be some missing information from last week's session, so give us a little time and we'll get that updated. I don't know exactly the process for getting today's session up on that website or how long it will take, so I'm not going to make any promises other than to say we've been recording the session and we hope to get it up as soon as possible. Devin, John, Trevor, can I send you some questions via chat, and who should I send it to, just so we can keep moving?
You can send them to me. This is John.
Okay. I'll do the first question verbally, and then I'll send, let's see. Someone asked what the abbreviation SSA stands for, and I answered, and this might be somebody else. It stands for Special Service Area, and it's very similar to a BID or Business Improvement District in other areas. I don't know if the three of you want to say anything more about that, but you can find the chat box, John.
Yep.
It should be on the right-hand side of your screen.
Okay.
Do you have it?
Yep.
Okay. So I don't know if the three of you want to say anything more about SSAs, but I just wanted to make sure we clarified that in many other places they're called Business Improvement Districts or BIDs. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's right. SSA is a special service area, and a BID is a business improvement district. They're a little bit different, but in terms of what they're going to likely ask on the exam, more than likely sort of identify a scenario and say, in this case, an SSA may be the best thing used or recommended, and then they'll say, what is an SSA, and they'll give you 4 different things to choose from. So they won't expect anything too specific with regard to a BID or an SSA, but just know what they are.
Great. Let's see. Oh, the person who asked this question just left, but we'll ask it anyway. Let's see. If impact fees are not necessarily allowed in all states, for example, they're illegal in Massachusetts, would it be a question on the AICP exam? And
No.
what I answered her in writing was, maybe the concept would be on the exam. I don't know. John, what do you think?
Well, no, yeah, but they're not going to ask specifically if a state is it illegal or not in that state, but they may ask you what an impact fee is.
Right.
So you need to understand what it is. Now, again, different states and different areas may have specific laws, but what they're trying to test is the general knowledge across the country as a whole. So understand what an impact fee is or an exaction fee is, even if where you are it's so nuanced it may be illegal or effectively illegal. Understand what it is. So, but they won't ask. They won't ask in what state is it illegal or illegal. Yeah. So understand what it is, assuming that if they're asking the question, it's not a trick question. It's do you understand what it is?
Okay.
And
go ahead,
Jamie,
sir.
I was just to add that just the fact, because one area or one state, it's illegal in one state, wouldn't rule it out from examination in the entire country. So.
Okay, great. Let's see. What is a good source to learn about the different types of economic analysis?
I think that go back to the recommended reading list, and again, this is it may be the part that is most uncomfortable or least familiar with the majority of people taking the examination, and they're going to ask you about PERT, or they're going to ask you about other types of economic analysis. They're not going to expect you to conduct any of it. They oftentimes in the wording of the question, they're giving you the answer because of the acronym that's used or the wording that they're used. The APA website is actually a good place to find some of this, but go back to the recommended reading list. Hold on, I'm pulling up right now.
Okay. While you're pulling that up, a follow-up question. Can you explain the differences between PERT, CPM, et cetera, maybe briefly, since we have some other questions to get through?
Yeah, let me actually hand that over to Dev or Trev, if either of you two want to. PERT, CPM, we'll pull up that information real quick. PERT is Program Evaluation and Review Technique. It's sort of a linear model where as you're walking through, it's first developed by, again, the Navy back in the 50s, but it's commonly used in conjunction with the CPM. And the CPM is a critical path method. But what these are used for is sort of, it graphically depicts a relationship about different tasks. So you're moving linearly from phase 1 to phase 2 in a process. At phase 2, depending on what is done, you can either go one direction or another direction. Think of a flow chart and sort of have your line and then a box with some text in it, and then a line with a box and some text in it. And depending on what decision is made where that box is, you can either go up or you can go down to another tier of decision-making processes. But that is what that is. I've talked with a number of people, and it seems that PERT is on the exam fairly often. They'll want you to sort of recognize what is PERT. I don't recall ever talking to anybody where critical path method or CPM has been on the exam, but there are some basic statistical reading materials, and there are some information on the APA's website that I think would be most helpful. If I can find those books or references, I'll try to pull those up.
Yeah, If you go on the APA's website, there's a section about
The last
exam
one.
prep, and there's a whole list of suggested readings from the APA website, so you could follow up there as well.
Correct.
Let's move on to the next question. Let's see, what level of knowledge do we need to understand for projections? I don't know if you can address that.
Real basic. They're not asking you to do calculated projections, but what they're going to say is they will give you some, let's say, some basic demographic information. And it may be an age pyramid or some sort of thing like that. And they will say, based on this and based on using projections based on the demographic information provided below, in 10 years, this community needs to start focusing on, and it may be building senior housing, an option may be building more elementary schools, and it may be providing more activities for college kids. And depending on where the age pyramid is and where the cohorts are lined up, you have to sort of look at where the bulk of the population is, project forward 10 years to see where the bulk of the population is, to say in 10 years the issue is going to be there's going to be a ton of people over the age of 55 or 65. They're going to start needing senior housing. Or if there's, if they say 5 years from now, but it looks like in the 1 year category there's a bunch of kids that have just been born, in 5 to 10 years, the elementary schools are going to have to need greater capacity. So it's pretty basic projections. They're not talking about anything you're going to have to calculate. They're going to give you the data set, or they're going to give you the information, and it's going to be very obvious. What they want you to do is be familiar with how to utilize projections, not how to calculate projections. So the statistical, the math, the analytical stuff they're expecting here is nominal. Let me just say that. You're not going to need a calculator. You're not going to understand derivatives or a complex calculation. You're not going to have to know how to do statistics. You need to understand the terminology. You need to understand what these things are used to project. You need to understand how they're used and why they're used. But there will not be complicated statistics. There will not be complicated projections. There will not be complicated math as part of this exam. They want you to understand what it is and how it's used.
Let's see.
I'm
Yeah.
going to contradict John just a bit. You can bring a calculator in, so he's saying you're not going to need a calculator. Bring it in. You may need it, but it is going to be basic math, and it might be just if you refer to the recommended reading list, it's Cliff Notes for statistics, so it's not incredibly difficult calculations, but you may have to calculate the percentage of one age group as compared to the population as a whole. So
okay, I'm getting some clarification from our attendees. You cannot bring your own calculator, but they provide you with one.
Okay.
And let's see, there was a step-down ratio calculation type question in the last exam, but then this person clarified it was simple calculations, and yes, they do provide a calculator.
Yeah.
Let's see, let me just go ahead.
The math is not what you'll get hung up on. You just understand what it is you're trying to do, and the math is as elementary as can be.
Great. Let's see, can you explain how TDRs are administered?
There's no one specific way on how a TDR is administered, and again, what you have to understand is the concept is when a TDR might be used. And let's say an objective is to keep development height in an area down. Maybe there's a bluff of an area has a great view to the sunsets or a great view to a mountain range. And rather than allowing intense or high development in that area, they will allow some of the development that would go in that area into another area by transferring the development rights of that site or area to more intense development on another site. It's an incentive to keep development down in an area, for instance. So it may very well be if someone owns some property and they want to keep certain area low intensity developed, low buildings or no development at all, they can say we will there are development rights that run with this property. We acknowledge that. We will transfer those development rights to another piece of property and transfer the rights of that development to someplace else, keeping this site unencumbered with development at all or overly intense development. So it doesn't matter how it's administered, because it's different from community to community, even if a community wants to take on this technique, but understand the value and what is a TDR. TDR is a transfer of development rights. They'll want you to know what it is or a scenario where it may be used as a tool. You're not going to have to worry about how it's administered. And you couldn't even answer how it is. It's different depending on location.
Great. I don't know if you can answer this off the top of your head, so I'll ask, and then maybe you can go back and find it. Someone was asking, what was the website for the Federal Energy Policy?
Oh, don't know.
Did you have it in your presentation? I have to admit I wasn't looking at that point.
You don't have our presentation memorized?
I'm working on it.
Yeah. Well,
I don't know
hold on.
if it is in your presentation. Go ahead and find it, and you can tell us when.
Let me see if I can't. Let's see
Okay.
if we've got it. I don't know.
Someone following up on the TDR question: could TDR be temporary, or are they all perpetual?
I've never heard of a temporary TDR because once the idea is that once a property, I suppose in theory everything is temporary development, but development for a residential structure will sit there for 100 years or more. Commercial development will sit there for 30 years or more. So I don't know of anybody that would look at, if I'm trying to preserve a line of sight view from a bluff to a sunset over a lake, that's a permanent asset to the community. If what I'm trying to do is transfer development rights for anything that could block that view, that's a permanent relocation of development rights. So I suppose in theory it could be temporary, but I couldn't imagine off the top of my head a scenario where there'd be a benefit to a temporary TDR. So that's a nuance that may be specific to a locale. You're not going to have to worry about that.
Great. Let's see. I'll answer this question. Someone's asking if we have a recommendation on how to set up a study group, if APA has any type of message boards. I'm not aware of any message boards, but what I would do is look to your local chapter. Each chapter should have a professional development officer, a PDO. That's what I am. And I think if you get in touch with your PDO and tell them that you want to set up a study group or find someone to help you study, that they should know who's taking the exam or be able to send out an email to the entire chapter and then, put together a list of people who are interested. That's my recommendation for how to deal with that.
And to go back to the energy policy real quick, we don't give the web address, but what we do is we say if you go back to the APA's website, the APA does have a policy guide for energy and climate change. And so if you go to the APA's website and look at that policy, that would be where we suggest you start looking at issues of energy and climate change, is the APA's website.
Yeah, and someone else asked, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, it's planning.org/research/energy.
And do you know if someone else asked earlier, is there a similar policy guide for budget and finance? Maybe you don't know the answer to that, but if you do, someone's asking.
We can have somebody start looking it up while we're talking about other things.
Okay. I didn't find anything when I was looking quickly, but you might have better luck than me. Let's see. John, did you get the one that I sent you to the chat? I don't know if you want to address that or not.
The one about Board of Adjustment?
Yeah.
It's interesting. Again, this is where there are some nuances.
No one else can see the question but you, so if you want to repeat it.
It says, did he just say the Board of Adjustments is a recommending body to council? And I think I know where this question is. Again, I don't remember seeing a question on the exam or hearing anybody talk about a Board of Adjustments. Using its ZBA, it's often referred to as a ZBA, Zoning Board of Appeals. ZBA is where you go to appeal and seek a variation or a variance to get relief from the underlying standards of a zoning district. In some communities, a Board of Adjustment has the authority to grant relief as a body, and it's not a recommending body to council. I'm guessing that's where this question is headed. Again, in some communities, a Board of Adjustment, a BOA, is the board has the ability to grant relief. It's not a recommending body. Zoning Board of Appeals, a ZBA, which is the only thing I've seen on the exam, ZBA is a recommending body, and again, I'm talking universally here. A ZBA is a recommending body to the City Council, recommending when a variation or variance should be granted. In some communities, a Board of Adjustment can grant the relief or the adjustment at that board, and it's not a recommending body. So generally speaking, ZBA is a recommending body. Board of Adjustment sometimes is and sometimes is not.
Great, thanks. And I'm going to, while we were on the session, I emailed APA to find out about the census question, and someone there confirmed. It says the 2012 AICP exam will only include questions from the 2000 census and none from the 2010 census. So that's the official answer from APA. So
okay, and that's more than likely because it takes a while to roll out census information. In some areas, it's not out yet.
Well, and I think they don't update the exam every year. So
correct.
Let's see. Yeah. Someone is asking again about the webinar, if it's available online. Again, please look at your chat window if you can find that. The link to the website where all of the review sessions will be is there. Let's see. I just emailed back to APA to see if they had a suggestion about a policy guide for budget and financing, so we'll hopefully get an answer to that soon.
Okay.
Let's see, the question here, what kind of specialized easements might be covered?
What kind of specialized easements?
Yeah, do you have any opinion on that?
No, I think people may be getting a bit too specific. Again, they're looking at, you might want to say that if pedestrian mobility is important to a community, but a lack of right-of-way exists along the corridor, what's one way to provide sidewalks where right-of-way doesn't exist? Well, you can get an access easement. If you get an adjacent property owner, you can get an access easement for a sidewalk or a bike trail, or communities have easements for all sorts of things. I've seen there's utility easements. I've seen pedestrian access easements. I've seen water access easements. There are all sorts of easements that are very specific. But it might relate back to a law type of a foundation. But understand, I can't imagine there being a question about easements on the exam. But understand that as an easement is some sort of, typically, again, generally, a public access over private property for a specific purpose. This is a public access easement through this property so everybody has access to the waterfront or the lake. This is an access easement through this property because we have to connect this area to this area. There is no right-of-way. We want pedestrians to be able to cross through here. So an easement is, utilities have easements on private property everywhere, so utility companies can get their trucks and servicemen and women to the infrastructure or utility that exists on that private property. It is a utility easement. So they're not going to get so nuanced as to say what are the different types or specific allocations of different types of access easements. I mean, know what an access easement is, but the range of the application of them is infinite.
And someone here is pointing out that an aviation easement, for example, would be to clear trees.
Yeah, I mean, the list of easements is infinite, but know what it is. It's basically some sort of limited or specific access either to an entity, a government agency, or the public over private property for a specific reason.
Great. Someone's asking, will the exam spell out acronyms like TDR stands for Transfer of Development Rights, or should we memorize the acronyms?
Memorize them. That could very well be a question. To prevent tall buildings from blocking line of sight to a monument, the community is employing TDRs to get development to be someplace else. What is a TDR? And they'll give you like, Trevor Dick's resume, transfer of development rights, whatever, and you've got to pick what a TDR is. So don't assume, in fact, that's one of the exam's favorite things is what is PERT, Program Evaluation and Review Technique? What is an EIS? What is whatever? So know the acronyms. They will not necessarily give them to you.
Great. I sent you another one via chat, John, if you want to address that, but I'm going to ask another question. And I'm not sure, it says, would there be quasi-judicial questions relating to different boards? I'm not sure I understand that question.
I'm not either.
Okay, if the person who sent that question could maybe say a little bit more about that question, we'll try to get it answered. Going back to when Trevor was presenting, I know he was talking about census information and population decrease. And I don't know if you have this at the ready, but someone was asking what different years were assumed for the decrease in population. And I'm sorry, I don't know exactly what figures were given to help you narrow that down, but do you know?
Hi, Jamie.
Hi, Trevor.
The slide was referring to the declining population of the Rust Belt cities, and it was from 2000 to 2010.
Okay, so it was the two censuses, censi, whatever, from 2000 to 2010. And someone asked, and I don't know if you just want to give your opinion, why would the population be declining in the Rust Belt? Is it because of the loss of manufacturing jobs?
Well, it's interesting. That would very well be a perfect exam question. Why is it? Inclement weather, people not like it. More than likely it's manufacturing or jobs. Why do people move out to Arizona, Nevada, and Florida? As they get older, they like the warm weather. Elderly people tend to move out there. It's newer. There's infrastructure is newer. It's warmer climate. It tends to be the growth shift of the country, the Rust Belt, as jobs, manufacturing jobs are lost. People move out. And that's a great question. Is below of the four possibilities identified below, what are likely reasons for the declining population in Rust Belt cities? And they may give you four and say A, B, C, D, or all of the above. So that's
Great.
that's almost a perfect example of the type of question you would get on the exam. Exactly, because there is no right answer. And here's another thing you have to understand: they're looking for the most right answer, and this is very confusing. It may very well be that you answer B, and technically that's correct, but C is a more correct answer. So they are looking for you to use your judgment as a planner. But that question may very well be on the exam. That's exactly the type of questions they ask.
Great. We have about 10 minutes left, so if people have questions, please keep them coming. I have 2 more. Going back to the, well, someone's asking Rust Belt, so what is the most correct answer?
Well, and again, I don't know if there is one. The biggest one I've got to think is going to be the decline in the manufacturing industry. I mean, as Detroit, Flint, some places in Indiana, Ohio, as manufacturing jobs leave the region, people are going to leave as well. That's very, very common. Then the older population, as again, populations across the country generally are all aging. And there is a national trend of people aging. Again, not everybody, but a trend of people retiring to warmer climates. So I know there's 2 right there. Now, depending on what questions they give in terms or answers they give in the multiple choice, there may be other ones as well. But those are 2 very valid ones.
Okay. So the person who asked about the quasi-judicial questions referring to different boards sent a little clarification. He says, we were recently made aware that some boards, such as design review boards, would have to follow quasi-judicial procedures. Does that ring a bell to you? Is that because if not, I think the best thing would be to contact APA and see if they have any.
Well, yeah, you define quasi-judicial. That's not even. Okay, they follow Roberts. You want to get technical? They follow Roberts Rules of Order. That's the legal rules. Quasi-judicial doesn't even really mean anything. You have to define that. Boards and commissions, elected boards and officials, appointed boards and commissions have to follow Roberts Rules of Order. For anybody who's out there as a planner who says, I have a, Mr. Chairman, I have a question about whatever. The chairman goes, you can't ask a question. We have a motion on the floor. Somebody made a motion. Do I have a second? Do I, if I don't have a second, the motion dies due to lack of second. I second the motion, but I want to amend the motion. Okay, do we have approval to amend the motion? That's Robert's Rule of Order. So I don't know what quasi-judicial is. They're not going to ask that, but what you're going to need to know is not the rules by which they have to function, but what is the role of a zoning board of appeals? What is the role of a plan commission? What is the role of city council in a procedure?
Great, thank you.
Hey, Jamie, I want to go back and clarify something about the Rust Belt communities in that one figure. The populations were from 1960 to 2010. So in 50 years, there's sort of a decline of those. Yeah.
Great, thanks. I just heard back from APA. APA does not have a policy guide for budgeting or finance. Just FYI for everybody. Hold on, let me get back to the question screen. Let's see, just some more comments on the quasi-judicial issue. If the person is from Vermont, quasi-judicial is typically what a development review board is called. They review subdivisions, variance requests, conditional use requests, etc. And then another person says the individual may be referring to a board of adjustment, which is a quasi-judicial board. And then another person says, additional clarification, should we be able to distinguish between ministerial, judicial, and quasi-judicial acts?
No. I've never heard of them ever asking questions that specific. It's never come up. Again, they're going to want you to know what is the purpose of a zoning board of appeals. What's their job? As a staff planner who's writing reports to the zoning board of appeals, what's your role as a staff planner in terms of writing reports or recommendations? What's the role of the plan commission in reviewing a plan unit development, and what should it consider before it makes a recommendation to city council? They're not going to expect you to know the legal conditions from state to state or wherever as to whether a plan commission is considered quasi-judicial or zoning board is. They're not going to ask that. That's the level of detail they're not going to get into here.
I'm getting more comments from people. Quasi-judicial roles vary by community.
Yes.
Does quasi-judicial refer to the way the meeting is run?
Exactly. They're not going to get into that. Yeah, they're not going to get into that. Again, they're going to want to know, they're going to say, like, you write a staff report to the plan commission recommending, staff recommends denial of a plan development. But because the proposed developer is the brother-in-law of the plan commission chairman, the plan commission chair says, hey, I want you to write the staff report saying the plan commission recommends it. What should you do to inform the plan commission as they prepare their recommendation for city council? understand the roles of the different boards and commissions. You do not have to understand the governance by which they operate. It will not come up. You're getting too specific.
Yeah, I was going to say I think we should move on from this question because we're getting a little too specific. Someone's asking, I must not have been clear, APA emailed me back and said they don't have a policy guide for budgeting and finance. Just want to make sure everyone heard that. There's a question here. The FAR question is always on the exam. Please explain floor area ratio.
Okay, floor area ratio, pretty straightforward. A floor area ratio is the ratio of the floor area of a building to the property area or the site area of a building. So let's say that you have a zoning lot, a property that is 20,000 square feet in size, this lot area. You have a building on that site, a one-story building that has a 10,000 square foot footprint or floor area. The FAR of that building is 0.5. The building area is 10,000 square feet. The lot area is 20,000 square feet. The FAR is 0.5. Now, let's say you have a 20,000 square foot lot, and you have a two-story, 5,000 square foot floor plan building. So the first floor is 5,000 square feet. The second floor is 5,000 square feet. The total floor area of that two-story building is still 10,000 square feet. So the FAR is still going to be 0.5. So FAR is floor area ratio. So it's the floor area of the building and the ratio of that to the lot area of the lot that that building is on. So again, if you had a 100,000 square foot lot and you had a 10,000 square foot building, the FAR is 0.1 or 10%. 10,000 square foot building, 100,000 square foot lot, FAR is 0.1. There will likely be an FAR. This is the level of calculation on the exam. Calculate the FAR of the proposed site plan, and they'll give you a building. They'll give you a building, whether it's 2-story, 3-story, 4-story, 5-story, or whatever. They will give you the lot area, and then they will ask you to calculate the FAR. But it's floor area ratio. I think what we're pulling up right now on your screens.
Wait, let's while you're finishing logging in, let me just ask one more question. Sorry, John, do you know where people can find key findings or outcomes from the 2000 census?
I would imagine key findings for the census. Best place to find that?
Yeah, the APA might even have something on their website.
I think the best place is right on the census website.
Okay.
For sure.
And I haven't visited the census website in a very long time, but I would think that there are some summary sheets that you could find and look at.
Yep. What you should have on the screen now, Jamie, if you can see it, is this is actually one of the questions from Planning Prep, the website.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. About
if you can see it on your screen, everybody. And what it shows here is it's a little image of the Planning Prep World Headquarters. And it is situated on a site that is 200 by 200 feet is the lot that the building is on. And it looks like the building covers up about half the lot, and the building is 8 stories tall. This is a typical type of question. So given this information and your understanding of FAR, what is the FAR of the building in the above diagram? So the building is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 stories tall. It covers half of the site. So the footprint of the building is half the site. It's 8 stories tall. That's the same as a 4-story building covering up the entire site. The FAR of this scenario is 4 or 4.0 is the FAR of this picture.
Great.
So if you go on the Planning Prep website, there is stuff about what is FAR, how to calculate it, but it's very simple. It's the floor area ratio, floor area of the building to the area of the site.
And I know that you just logged into planningprep.com. Do you want to say anything about that? Because people are asking. I guess the first webinar hosted mentioned Planning Prep, so I don't know if you want to tell people where to find it, what it is, and et cetera.
Yeah, it's real quickly. It's Planning Prep was developed about 8 years ago or so as a website for people to prepare for the AICP exam. We have had people use the AICP or the Planning Prep website from nearly every state and in several countries. You know, you may be a planner in the middle of Timbuktu and not have any planners around to have a study group with, and this is a great resource, or in another country. There are 7 practice exams. There are different categories. It used to be for the first 7 years of the site, it was a fee-based site. You had to pay to take it or pay to register. The site is now free. This is something we've developed. It was developed by Devin Levine and Trevor Dick, two of the presenters here. And it was developed by them about 8 years ago. And we have launched the site free about a year ago or so. So you can go on to planningprep.com, register, and it's a great tool to prepare for the exam. You can query the questions by, like, I only want to focus on law or legal questions because I'm not good at that. You can filter out everything else. There's thousands of questions, and you can just focus on legal questions, or you can just focus on implementation questions, or you can just focus on history questions. You can track how well you do. You can see if you're doing well or not doing well. Questions provide, we have the question. We provide the answers. We say why. If the answer is D, we say why D is the correct answer. And for most questions, there's a link. And if you click on the link, it'll take you to a newspaper article or a planning prep article or an APA website that gives further information. So it's a great study tool to go in and help augment your preparation for the exam.
Great. Thanks, John. I'm only going to cut you off because it's 10 o'clock, so we've reached the end of our session, and I don't want to keep people any longer. I think the question that you've pulled up is actually a good one because someone pointed out that sometimes on the exam they will give you the FAR, and you have to calculate the building area. So I think this question that you're showing here is actually a good example of that.
Yep.
I believe we answered probably 99% of the questions that were asked.
Super.
So I want to thank John, Devin, and Trevor for their time and remind everybody that this session was recorded and it will be up on the Utah chapter's website, so check there. Give us a couple days. Next week, next Friday, we'll be doing this again. John, Devin, and Trevor will be joining us again on March 16th, and so we'll hear from everybody again then. And just one last quick question. Someone's asking, I was under the impression there are 170 questions on the exam. This site indicates 150. I know that they put some practice test questions on the exam. I don't know if that's the discrepancy.
Yeah, they put there are questions that they have on the exam every year that don't count. They're sort of equator questions, and they don't count to your score. So there are questions on the exam that don't count toward your total score, but they ask them anyway, sort of at equator questions, and also questions to sort of get you used to taking questions in the electronic format. So not every question asked counts toward your score, but you don't know which questions necessarily do or don't, so you have to answer them all.
Great. Let's see. I'm sorry. I had one more thing I wanted to say, and I completely blanked on it. Oh, the other thing I wanted to mention is that in addition to planning prep having practice exams, the APA website also has practice exams available. So on APA's website, that's just another source for practice exam. Plus, there are other review materials available for purchase on the APA website, just as another source of information. So I think we're done. Again, thanks to John, Devin, and Trevor, and I hope to hear from everybody again in 2 weeks. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Jamie.
Bye.
Bye.